The wind howled through the cracks of the century-old Wilson farmhouse as 6-year-old Ethan bolted upright in his bed, his small hands clutching his dinosaur-printed sheets. It wasn't the storm that had awakened him. No, it was something else. A desperate scratching sound inside his bedroom wall, followed by what could only be described as a whimper. "Daddy!" Ethan called out, his voice barely audible above the winter gale. But his father, exhausted from working double shifts, slept soundly down the hall. Summoning courage that belied his years, Ethan slid from his bed and pressed his ear against the faded wallpaper. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. Something alive was trapped inside his wall. And from the weakening sounds, Ethan knew with terrible certainty that whatever it was dying. "I hear you," he whispered, his small palm flat against the cold surface. "I promise I'll help you." What the adults would discover when they finally believed him would shake their small Montana town to its very core. Pine Ridge, Montana, wasn't much more than a speck on the map, especially when buried under 15 inches of February snow, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, for better or worse. The Wilson house stood at the edge of town, a 2-story Victorian that had seen better days, with peeling paint and a sagging porch that creaked under the weight of accumulated snow. Jackson Wilson, 42, moved through his morning routine. With military precision, a habit from his 12 years as an Army medic. The precision remained, though little else from that life did. His wife's death 2 years ago had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of a man who functioned primarily for one reason: Ethan. His 6-year-old son, Ethan, wasn't like other kids. The autism diagnosis came when he was 3, explaining his sensitivity to sounds, his occasional retreats into silence, and his intense focus on details others missed. Jackson loved his son fiercely, but sometimes struggled to breach the walls between Ethan's world and his own. "Daddy, it's still there," Ethan said that morning, methodically arranging his cereal into perfect rows before eating. "In my wall, it's crying." Jackson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Buddy, we've talked about this. Old houses make noises. It's just the pipes or the wind." "No," Ethan insisted, his blue eyes, so like his mother's, fixed on some middle distance. "It's alive and it's scared." The foreclosure notice sat hidden in Jackson's dresser drawer upstairs, 3 months behind on the mortgage, and the Pine Ridge National Bank wasn't known for patience. The last thing he needed was to tear open a wall for his son's imagination. Dr. Sarah Thompson, the town's only veterinarian, had been Caroline Wilson's best friend. At 55, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, she was one of the few people Ethan would speak to willingly. Sheriff Mike Blackwood, with his weathered face and skeptical squint, had known Jackson since they were boys down the street. Elderly Miss Eleanor Jenkins watched over the neighborhood from her porch rocker, regardless of the season. These were the people of Pine Ridge, hardworking, proud, and private. They had carried Jackson through Caroline's funeral, brought casseroles and awkward condolences. But as time passed, the casseroles stopped coming, and Jackson found himself increasingly alone in caring for a child few understood. What none of them realized was how this snowy February morning would bind their lives together in ways none could imagine. For the 3rd consecutive night, Ethan refused to sleep in his room. Jackson found him curled in the hallway outside his bedroom door, clutching his stuffed dinosaur and a flashlight. "The sounds are louder tonight," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. "It's crying because it can't find its babies." Jackson lifted his son, feeling the slight weight of him, the rapid beating of his heart. "Buddy, we've checked. Remember I looked behind your bookshelf yesterday?" "Not there," Ethan insisted. "Inside. You have to listen with your heart, not your ears." It was nearly midnight when Jackson, exhausted from his shift at the town's medical center, finally relented. He sat cross-legged on Ethan's bedroom floor, feeling ridiculous as he pressed his ear against the wall. The house creaked and settled around them, the wind whistling through poorly insulated windows. Nothing unusual. "See, sport? Just an old house talking to itself," Jackson ruffled Ethan's hair, but the boy's expression remained solemn. "Wait," Ethan commanded with unusual assertiveness. "Just wait." And then Jackson heard it, a faint scratching, followed by what could only be described as a whimper. His body tensed, military training kicking in as he scanned the room. That's not the pipes," he said. "I told you," Ethan said simply, no triumph in his voice. "It's been calling for help for days." Jackson spent the remainder of the night researching on his phone. Mice, squirrels, raccoons, any animal that might have become trapped in the wall. By morning, dark circles rimmed his eyes, matching the worry lines etched across his forehead. At breakfast, Ethan silently pushed a drawing across the table. It showed dark shapes inside a black space, with smaller shapes huddled together in the corner of the paper. He had written in his careful first-grade script, "They're hungry." Jackson stared at the paper, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the drafty kitchen. "Ethan, how do you know there's more than one?" "I hear the little ones too," Ethan said, "but they don't cry as much anymore." The simple way he said it made Jackson's throat tighten. After dropping Ethan at school with Mrs. Jenkins, who worked as a teacher's aide, Jackson did something he'd been avoiding. He called Sheriff Blackwood. "An animal's in the wall," he explained. Mike's gruff voice held undisguised skepticism. "Jack, you know what the county charges for animal control calls these days? Odds are it's just mice." "It's not mice, Mike," Jackson said. "I heard it too." He hesitated. "Ethan's convinced whatever it is has babies. He's not sleeping. He's drawing these pictures." There was a long silence on the line. "This about the foreclosure? Bank giving you trouble again?" "No," Jackson snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. "Look, I just need someone to take a look, please." Mike sighed. "For Caroline's kid." It was low, using his late wife's name, but it worked. Sheriff Blackwood arrived that afternoon with Deputy Harris, a thin man with eager eyes who'd moved to Pine Ridge only last year. "Don't see why we're wasting department resources on rodents," Deputy Harris muttered as they examined the wall in Ethan's room. "Because we serve this community, Tom," Sheriff Blackwood replied sharply. "Even the small problems." They knocked on the wall, listened, checked the baseboards. Nothing after 20 minutes. The sheriff gave Jackson an apologetic look. "Maybe it moved on, Jack. Or maybe the kid's just making it up," Deputy Harris finished, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who had already formed an opinion. Jackson felt his face flush. Ethan doesn't make things up. That's not how he is. The men were heading for the door when Ethan arrived home with Mrs. Jenkins. The boy took one look at the adults in the hallway and froze. "Did you find them?" he asked, voice small. "There's nothing there, son," Deputy Harris said, bending down with forced cheerfulness. "But don't worry. Monsters aren't real." "Not monsters," Ethan corrected seriously. Mommy and her babies. They're real." Without warning, tears began streaming down his face, an unusual display for a child who rarely showed emotion. "They'll die if you don't listen." The raw desperation in his voice silenced everyone. Mrs. Jenkins knelt beside him, her arthritic knees creaking. "Ethan, honey, why don't we all go listen again? Okay?" The group returned to Ethan's room. The boy walked directly to a specific spot on the wall and placed his palm against it. "Here, be very quiet." For 2 full minutes they stood in uncomfortable silence. Jackson was about to speak when Sheriff Blackwood raised his hand sharply. There it was, a faint scratching, then a distinct whine, followed by weaker, higher-pitched sounds. "Well, I'll be damned," the sheriff whispered. "There really is something in there." The decision to open the wall was not made lightly. Jackson stood in Ethan's bedroom, staring at the faded blue wallpaper with a knot in his stomach. The foreclosure hearing was just 2 weeks away, and any damage to the house would only give Pine Ridge National Bank more ammunition against him. We could call animal control from the next county, Sheriff Blackwood suggested, his weathered hands resting on his belt. But that'd take at least a day to get someone out here with this storm. Whatever's in there might not have a day, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice carrying the weight of her 75 years. She had remained after bringing Ethan home, concern etched in the lines around her eyes. Ethan stood silently by the window, small fingers tracing patterns on the frosted glass. The mommy is very tired now, he said without turning around. She's trying to be brave for her babies. Jackson exchanged glances with the sheriff. There was something unsettling about the certainty in his son's voice. Let's do it, he decided. I've got tools in the basement. Word traveled fast in Pine Ridge. By the time Jackson returned with his toolbox, Dr. Thompson's truck was pulling into the driveway, and 3 neighbors stood on the porch, stamping snow from their boots. Heard you've got a situation, Dr. Thompson said, medical bag in hand, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Figured you might need some help if there's an injured animal. Jackson felt a rush of gratitude. Sarah, you didn't have to come out in this weather. Don't be ridiculous, she replied briskly. Caroline would haunt me if I didn't. She lowered her voice. Besides, I heard Tom Harris was here. That man couldn't tell the difference between a raccoon and a rat terrier. The small crowd filed into the house, bringing with them the scent of snow and wood smoke. Jackson felt a flash of embarrassment at the shabby living room. The couch, with its worn patches, the empty spaces on the walls where he'd sold paintings to pay for Ethan's therapy, but no one seemed to notice as they followed him upstairs. Sheriff Blackwood had already cleared the furniture away from the wall. I'm thinking we start with a small hole, see what we're dealing with, he said, accepting the drywall saw Jackson offered. Should we take Ethan downstairs? Mrs. Jenkins asked quietly. No. The boy's voice was firm. I need to stay. I promised. Jackson nodded, understanding that this was important to his son in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. All right, but stand back with Mrs. Jenkins. Sheriff Blackwood marked a 12-inch square on the wall and began carefully cutting. Plaster dust filled the air as the saw broke through decades-old lath. The onlookers held their breath, expecting a rush of panicked rodents or perhaps an angry raccoon. What they saw instead, as the sheriff shone his flashlight through the small opening, was a pair of exhausted brown eyes staring back at them. Good Lord, breathed the sheriff, pulling back slightly. It's a dog. Dr. Thompson shouldered, past him, peering into the darkness. Not just any dog, that's a service animal. Look at the vest remains. We need to make this hole bigger now. The urgency in her voice spurred them to action. Jackson and the sheriff worked in tandem, carefully enlarging the opening while Dr. Thompson prepared supplies from her bag. 20 minutes later, the wall gaped open enough to reveal the full, heartbreaking scene. A severely emaciated golden retriever lay on her side in the narrow space between walls. Her once golden coat was matted and filthy, her body little more than skin, stretched over bones. But most shocking of all were the 5 tiny puppies huddled against her belly, their eyes still closed, impossibly small against their mother's depleted frame. That's Hope, gasped one of the neighbors, a retired firefighter named Bill Johnson. The search and rescue dog that went missing during the Riders Pass operation last summer. We looked for her for weeks. A collective murmur ran through the small crowd. Hope had been something of a local celebrity, a highly trained rescue dog who had helped locate lost hikers in Montana's unforgiving wilderness. 6 months ago, during a mission to find a missing hiker, she had disappeared, presumed to have fallen from a cliff or been taken by a mountain lion. How in God's name did she end up inside your wall? Sheriff Blackwood asked, bewilderment clear in his voice. No one had an answer, but there was no time for questions. Dr. Thompson was already assessing the situation with professional efficiency. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished, but she's alive. The puppies can't be more than a week old, which means she was already pregnant when she got trapped. She looked up at Jackson. She must have found a way into the house through the foundation and gotten stuck trying to find a safe place to give birth. Ethan had edged closer, his eyes never leaving the dog. "I told you she was a mommy," he whispered. The rescue operation proceeded with careful precision. Dr. Thompson administered fluids via syringe to the weakened mother while instructing the others on how to safely extract her and the puppies. Hope made no sound as gentle hands lifted her from her prison, her eyes fixed on her puppies with fierce maternal vigilance despite her weakened state. When all 6 animals were finally free, laid carefully on blankets in the center of Ethan's room, a palpable sense of awe filled the space. How had this dog survived months trapped inside a wall? How had she managed to deliver and keep 5 puppies alive? "She found water somewhere," Dr. Thompson said, indicating a small leak in a pipe that ran through the wall cavity. "And there are remains of mice and insects. She survived on whatever she could catch." The admiration in her voice was evident. "I've never seen anything like this." As the adults discussed next steps, Ethan quietly sat down beside Hope's head. To everyone's surprise, the exhausted dog lifted her muzzle slightly, her tail, giving the faintest thump against the blanket. "Hello," Ethan said softly, in the clear voice he rarely used with strangers. "I heard you calling. I told them you were real." Hope's eyes, though dimmed by suffering, focused on the boy's face. She extended her tongue just enough to touch his hand, a gesture of such profound gratitude that several onlookers turned away, overcome. In that moment, something shifted in the room and in the trajectory of all their lives. Dr. Thompson wasted no time converting Ethan's bedroom into a makeshift veterinary ward. The puppies, each barely larger than a hamster, were placed in a laundry basket lined with towels warmed in the dryer. Hope watched their every move with exhausted vigilance, her eyes never leaving her offspring, even as Dr. Thompson inserted an IV line into her foreleg. "She's severely dehydrated and malnourished," the veterinarian explained, her voice professional, yet tinged with wonder. "I've never seen a dog this compromised still producing milk for her puppies. She must have been living on almost nothing." Jackson stood in the doorway, one hand on Ethan's shoulder, watching as neighbors brought in supplies. Heating pads, puppy formula, extra blankets. The news had spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. Hope, the hero search and rescue dog, had been found alive inside the Wilson wall. "Dad," Ethan said, looking up with those solemn blue eyes. "She knew I would hear her." Jackson squeezed his son's shoulder, unable to explain the swell of emotion in his chest. For 2 years since Caroline's death, he had felt like he was failing at fatherhood, unable to break through the walls of Ethan's world. Now, somehow, his son's difference had become a gift that saved lives. By nightfall, the local newspaper reporter and the Pine Ridge High School's journalism teacher had both visited, snapping photos and taking notes. Sheriff Blackwood had coordinated with the mountain search and rescue team, who were sending Hope's former handler as soon as the roads cleared. Facebook and Twitter were ablaze with the miraculous story, comments pouring in from across Montana and beyond. Not everyone's reaction was positive. Deputy Harris lingered at the edge of the activity, his face troubled. "Something doesn't add up," he muttered to Sheriff Blackwood. "That dog disappeared miles from here. How'd she get into Wilson's walls? And who's going to pay for all this damage?" The sheriff gave him a sharp look. "Not the time, Tom." But the deputy's questions planted seeds of doubt. By morning, Pine Ridge had divided into factions, those celebrating the miracle and those questioning the story. Jackson overheard the whispers at the convenience store when he went for supplies. "Convenient, isn't it? Wilson's about to lose that house and suddenly there's a hero dog in his wall. I heard the bank was going to foreclose next. Weak, but what about those puppies? You can't fake that. Still seems mighty strange." He returned home to find a news van from Missoula parked outside. A reporter with perfect hair caught him at the front door. "Mr. Wilson, can you Tell us how you discovered Hope. Do you have any theory on how a search dog missing for 6 months ended up inside your home? Jackson pushed past, muttering, no comment, his ears burning with embarrassment and anger. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. Dr. Thompson sat at the kitchen table with a grim expression. Mrs. Jenkins was brewing coffee, her movements jerky with tension. What's happened? Jackson asked, setting down the grocery bags. Mountain Search and Rescue called, Dr. Thompson said. They're sending Hope's original handler, Marcus Reeves. He was under investigation for her disappearance. Some believed he might have abandoned her after she was injured on a mission. She paused. He's been cleared, but there are still questions. And now, with her turning up here. They think I stole a search dog? Jackson felt a surge of indignation. That's insane. I didn't even know she was in my wall until yesterday. Mrs. Jenkins placed a steadying hand on his arm. Nobody's accusing you, dear. But it is a mystery how she got here. This house is nearly 5 miles from where she went missing. Upstairs, Ethan sat cross-legged beside Hope. The dog had improved dramatically overnight, accepting small amounts of food and water. The puppies, too, seemed stronger, their tiny bodies wriggling with more vigor as they nursed. She was looking for a safe place, Ethan said when Jackson came to check on them. It wasn't clear if he was speaking to his father or to Hope. She knew her babies were coming, and she was scared. Jackson knelt beside his son. Ethan, did you ever see Hope before? Maybe in the yard or around town? Ethan shook his head. No, but I heard her stories in my head when she cried. A chill ran up Jackson's spine. Before Caroline's illness, he would have dismissed such talk, but grief had opened him to life's mysteries. How his wife could be vibrant one day and gone 3 months later. How his silent son could sometimes know things he shouldn't. Dr. Thompson entered with fresh bandages for Hope's paws, which were raw from her attempts to escape the wall. Jackson, the bank manager called. He wants access to inspect the damage to the property. Jackson swore under his breath, then apologized. The last thing he needed was George Harrington, the cold-eyed manager of Pine Ridge National Bank, using this situation against him. I'll handle it, he said, though he had no idea how. By afternoon, Hope's story had reached national news. The Mountain Search and Rescue team released footage of her previous missions, Hope finding a lost child during a blizzard, Hope locating an injured hiker trapped under fallen rocks. The clips humanized her, transformed her from a random dog to a hero who had saved multiple lives. Dr. Thompson discovered hidden passageways throughout the old house, remnants from the Prohibition era when the property had reportedly been used to hide moonshine. Hope had likely crawled in through the basement, becoming trapped when part of the narrow tunnel collapsed behind her. The amazing thing, Dr. Thompson told a growing crowd of visitors, is that she managed to navigate to an exterior wall where her sounds could be heard. Most trapped animals would have panicked, but she methodically sought a way to communicate. As Hope's strength gradually returned, so did Ethan's voice. The boy, who typically spoke only when necessary, now chatted constantly to the golden retriever, telling her about his school, his dinosaur collection, and his mother, who lives in the sky now. Jackson found himself watching these one-sided conversations with a mixture of joy and heartache. His son had never spoken this freely to him, not even before Caroline died. He's connecting, Mrs. Jenkins said, catching Jackson's expression as they prepared dinner. Don't be jealous of a dog, dear. Jackson flushed. I'm not. But he stopped himself. Maybe he was, just a little. Hope understands him, Mrs. Jenkins continued, her hand steady as she chopped carrots. She doesn't judge or expect. That's powerful for a child like Ethan. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. A fund for Hope's medical care raised thousands within hours. People drove from neighboring towns bearing gifts for the puppies. A veterinary supply company donated equipment. For the first time in 2 years, the Wilson house buzzed with life and warmth. But as public interest grew, so did scrutiny. Why hadn't Jackson noticed a dog living in his walls sooner? How had Hope survived the bitter Montana winter? And the question that troubled Jackson most: what would happen to Hope and her puppies once they recovered? Marcus Reeves arrived 3 days after Hope's discovery, driving through the night from Glacier National Park, where he now worked. He was younger than Jackson expected, perhaps mid-30s, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much tragedy. "I never abandoned her," were his first words to Jackson, spoken on the porch before he even entered the house. "I loved that dog more than anything. We cleared every inch of that mountain looking for her." Jackson nodded, recognizing the raw grief in the man's voice. "I believe you." Inside, Reeves knelt beside Hope, who recognized him immediately. Her tail thumped weakly against the floor, and she whined softly as he buried his face in her filthy fur. "Hey, girl," he whispered, voice breaking. "You had me worried sick." Ethan watched this reunion with solemn eyes, then tugged on Reeves's sleeve. "She says she tried to find you, but then the baby started growing in her tummy, and she got too tired." Reeves looked startled, then smiled gently at the boy. "You must be the hero who heard her." "I'm not a hero," Ethan replied, matter-of-factly. "My ears just work different." The handler stayed for dinner, sharing stories of Hope's training and service. Born to a champion line of retrievers, she had shown exceptional intelligence and empathy from puppyhood. Her specialty was finding children. Something about their scent or energy called to her in ways adult survivors didn't. She once tracked a 4-year-old through 3 miles of forest during a thunderstorm, Reeves recalled, his eyes distant with memory. Found him huddled under a log, hypothermic but alive. As the evening progressed, the unspoken question hung heavy in the room. Who did Hope belong to now? The situation grew more complicated the next morning when George Harrington arrived from the bank, accompanied by Deputy Harris. The bank manager was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown that had deepened since his grandson's disappearance during a family camping trip last summer. "Mr. Wilson," he said without preamble, "I need to inspect the damage to the property." Jackson led them upstairs, tension evident in every line of his body. Harrington surveyed the broken wall with cold calculation. "This will need to be documented for the foreclosure proceedings," he said, making notes on a tablet. "Significant damage to an interior wall." "The wall can be repaired," Jackson began, but Harrington cut him off. "Mr. Wilson, your financial situation was precarious before you decided to destroy bank property. This situation, while touching, doesn't change the fact that you've defaulted on your mortgage." Hope, who had been dozing beside her puppies, suddenly raised her head and stared at Harrington. A low growl rumbled in her chest. The bank manager took an instinctive step back. "Control that animal, please." "She doesn't like you," Ethan said from the doorway, his voice oddly flat. "She remembers your smell." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Deputy Harris cleared his throat. "What does he mean by that?" Ethan tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "She says you smell like the little boy who was lost, the one who was crying by the water." The color drained from Harrington's face. His grandson, 8-year-old Timothy, had vanished near Riders Pass Lake, the same area where Hope had disappeared. Despite weeks of searching, including efforts by Mountain Search and Rescue, the boy's body was never found. The prevailing theory was that he had fallen into the lake and drowned. "That's enough," Jackson said sharply, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Mr. Harrington, I understand your concerns about the house. If you'll give me a week, I'll make arrangements for repairs." But Harrington wasn't listening. He stared at Hope with an expression of dawning horror and hope. "What else does she remember?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could respond, Dr. Thompson entered with lunch for Hope, seeing the tension in the room. "Is everything all right in here?" "We were just finishing," Jackson said firmly. Mr. Harrington was leaving. The bank manager nodded distractedly, his eyes still fixed on Hope. Yes, I'll be in touch." At the doorway, he turned back. "The boy, your son, how does he know about my grandson?" Jackson shook his head. "He doesn't. He sometimes says things." After Harrington and Deputy Harris departed, Jackson found Marcus Reeves on the back porch, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. "You heard?" Jackson asked, joining him in the cold air. Reeves nodded. "That was the mission when Hope disappeared. We were looking for the Harrington boy." He exhaled a plume of smoke that instantly crystallized in the frigid air. 5 days of searching. Hope picked up his trail, then suddenly bolted off into a ravine. I couldn't keep up. By the time I reached the area, there was no sign of either of them. "You think she found him?" Reeves shrugged, his expression haunted. "I don't know, but Hope wouldn't have abandoned a search unless—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Inside, Ethan continued his one-sided conversations with Hope, seemingly unaware of the stir his words had caused. As the afternoon wore on, news crews returned, hoping for updates on the miraculous rescue dog. Jackson declined interviews but couldn't stop neighbors from sharing theories and speculations. By evening, Pine Ridge buzzed with renewed talk about Timothy Harrington's disappearance. Had Hope found the boy after all? Was there more to the story than anyone realized? As Jackson tucked Ethan into bed, now sharing the guest room while Hope and her puppies occupied his bedroom, he gently probed for answers. "Ethan, what did you mean about Mr. Harrington smelling like the lost boy?" Ethan yawned, already half asleep. "Hope told me she found a little boy by the water. He was cold. She tried to keep him warm, but he went to sleep and wouldn't wake up. Then the rocks fell, and she couldn't get out." Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty house. "Did Hope tell you anything else about the boy?" But Ethan was already asleep, his face peaceful in a way it seldom was while awake. Downstairs, Jackson found Marcus Reeves and Dr. Thompson deep in conversation. "We need to tell Sheriff Blackwood," Dr. Thompson was saying. "If what Ethan said is true, it's the ramblings of a child with autism," Reeves interrupted, though his expression betrayed his uncertainty. "We can't reopen a case based on that." "But if Hope did find Timothy," Dr. Thompson persisted, "if she knows where his body is, then we find it ourselves," Jackson said from the doorway. "Tomorrow, before this becomes a media circus." The three adults looked at each other, bound by a shared understanding of what might lie ahead. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Pine Ridge in a fresh blanket of silence. Dawn broke with painful brilliance over the snow-covered landscape of Pine Ridge. Jackson had barely slept, his mind churning with Ethan's words and their implications. If Hope had indeed found Timothy Harrington in her final mission, the consequences would ripple through their small community in ways he could scarcely imagine. Dr. Thompson arrived early, her medical bag heavier than usual. "I brought everything I might need for Hope," she explained, stamping snow from her boots. "She's stronger, but not out of the woods yet." "She ate well last night," Jackson reported, leading the way upstairs. "And the puppies are more active." They found Ethan already awake, sitting cross-legged beside Hope's makeshift bed. The golden retriever lay on her side, allowing her puppies to nurse, her eyes more alert than they had been since her rescue. "Good morning, beautiful girl," Dr. Thompson said softly, kneeling to examine her patient. Hope's tail thumped, weakly against the blankets in recognition. "Let's check those vitals, shall we?" As the veterinarian worked, Marcus Reeves appeared in the doorway, his expression guarded. "Sheriff Blackwood called. He's coming over with Harrington." Apparently, the bank manager couldn't sleep after yesterday, Jackson sighed. "So much for our quiet investigation." "Dad," Ethan said suddenly, his voice unnervingly clear, Hope needs to go back to the mountain today. The adults exchanged glances. Sweetie, Hope isn't strong enough to go anywhere, Dr. Thompson explained gently. She needs rest and care. Ethan shook his head with unusual vehemence. She says she has to show us where the sleeping boy is today, before the new snow covers everything. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the tiny squeaking sounds of the nursing puppies. Jackson knelt beside his son. Ethan, did Hope tell you anything else about the sleeping boy? He has something shiny in his pocket. Ethan replied matter-of-factly. Something important. Hope tried to bring it back, but couldn't carry it in her mouth. Reeves's sharp intake of breath drew Jackson's attention. Timothy was carrying a family heirloom, the handler explained quietly. A silver compass that belonged to his great-grandfather. George mentioned it during the search, said, "It was irreplaceable." Before Jackson could respond, the doorbell rang, its harsh peal startling Hope, who growled softly. Downstairs, Sheriff Blackwood waited with George Harrington. The bank manager looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his eyes red-rimmed behind his glasses, his normally immaculate suit rumpled. "Wilson," he said without preamble, "I need to speak with your boy about what he said yesterday." Jackson bristled. "Ethan is not a circus act, George. He's a child with autism who sometimes says things he doesn't fully understand." "Please," Harrington's voice cracked on the word, "if there's any chance at all, that he knows something about Timothy." Sheriff Blackwood placed a steadying hand on the banker's shoulder. "Jack, we're not here to upset the boy, but if there's information about Timothy's location, we need to know. His parents deserve closure." The weight of that truth settled heavily on Jackson. He nodded reluctantly. "Ethan's upstairs with Hope, but I'm warning you now. Don't push him. He gets overwhelmed easily." As they climbed the stairs, Jackson added quietly, "And George, whatever happens, this doesn't change the foreclosure situation. I don't want my son used as a bargaining chip." Harrington looked genuinely shocked. "You think I would?" He shook his head. "This isn't about your mortgage, Wilson. This is about my grandson." In Ethan's room, Dr. Thompson had finished her examination of Hope. "Blood pressure still low, but improving," she reported. "She's producing milk, which is remarkable given her condition." The newcomer's arrival caused Hope to struggle to her feet, swaying slightly. Marcus Reeves moved to steady her, murmuring reassurances. The dog's eyes fixed on George Harrington with unsettling intensity. "Hello, Hope," the banker said softly. "Do you remember me from the search?" The retriever's tail gave a single uncertain wag. Ethan, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke. "She remembers you shouting the boys' name over and over. It echoed in the trees." Harrington paled. Yes, I was there for the first 3 days until they made me go home." He knelt, bringing himself to Ethan's eye level. "Son, yesterday you said Hope remembered my grandson. Does she know where Timothy is?" Ethan didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked at Hope, then back at the adults. "She wants to show you today. She says the water is frozen now, so it's safe to cross." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Blackwood cleared his throat. "The lake would be frozen solid by now. If the boy is there—" "We need to go," Harrington said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now, before another storm hits." Dr. Thompson shook her head firmly. "Hope is in no condition to make such a journey. She's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and recovering from multiple injuries." "But if she's our only link to finding Timothy," Harrington began. "She can't go," Dr. Thompson interrupted. "And that's final. As her attending veterinarian, I forbid it." The tension in the room escalated until Hope suddenly stood on trembling legs. She took a few wobbly steps toward the door, then looked back at the humans, her intention clear despite her weakness. "See?" Ethan said simply. "She wants to go." Jackson found himself torn between medical logic and something deeper, an instinct that told him Hope's determination transcended physical limitations. "What if we compromise? Take Hope in a vehicle as close as possible to the area. Carry her if necessary." Dr. Thompson looked conflicted. "It's medically inadvisable." "What about the puppies?" Reeves asked practically. "They can't be separated from her for long." "Mrs. Jenkins can bottle feed them for a few hours," Jackson suggested. "She raised orphaned lambs on her farm for years." The discussion continued, growing more heated until Ethan's clear voice cut through the debate. "Hope says we have to hurry. She can feel the storm coming." Something in the boy's tone silenced them all. Even Dr. Thompson seemed to recognize the futility of further argument. "Fine," she conceded reluctantly, "but I'm coming along with medical supplies. And at the first sign of distress, we turn back immediately." Within the hour, an unlikely search party assembled. Sheriff Blackwood's SUV would lead, followed by Jackson's truck with Ethan, Hope, and Dr. Thompson. Marcus Reeves and George Harrington would bring up the rear in the banker's luxury sedan, an impractical vehicle for mountain roads. But Harrington had refused to be left behind. Mrs. Jenkins arrived to care for the puppies, her ancient thermos filled with puppy formula. "Don't you worry about these little ones," she assured Hope, who whined anxiously as she was separated from her babies. "Grandma Jenkins has raised everything from lambs to raccoons. They'll be right as rain when you return." The drive to Ryder's Pass took nearly 2 hours, the vehicles moving cautiously along roads still partially blocked from the recent snowfall. Hope lay on a blanket across Ethan's lap in the back seat, her eyes alert despite her exhaustion. "Is she in pain?" Jackson asked Dr. Thompson, who monitored the dog's vital signs periodically. "Some," the veterinarian admitted. "But there's something driving her. Something stronger than pain or weakness." Ethan stroked Hope's head with gentle fingers. "She made a promise to the boy," he said. "She told him she'd bring people back to find him." Jackson met Dr. Thompson's eyes in the rearview mirror, sharing a moment of uncertainty. Was this a child's imagination or something more? Either way, they were committed now. They reached the ranger station at Ryder's Pass just before noon. Sheriff Blackwood conferred briefly with the park rangers, explaining their unusual mission. Skepticism was evident in the rangers' expressions, but they provided snowmobiles for the final leg of the journey to the lake. "Hope can ride with me," Reeves said, fashioning a secure harness that would hold the dog safely against his chest. "She knows my commands, my scent. If she's going to guide us anywhere, it should be through me." No one argued with this logic. Hope seemed to gain strength from her handler's presence, standing more steadily as he fitted the harness around her thin frame. "The lake's about 4 miles in," the head ranger explained, pointing to a map. "The terrain's rough, especially with this snow cover. If you're not back by nightfall, we'll send out a search team. I'm not losing anyone else on this mountain." The snowmobiles roared to life, their noise startling against the pristine quiet of the wilderness. Ethan, securely sandwiched between Jackson and Dr. Thompson on one machine, watched wide-eyed as they began their ascent into the mountains. The journey was grueling. Twice they had to stop to check Hope's condition, Dr. Thompson insisting on administering subcutaneous fluids to combat dehydration. The dog's determination never wavered, though her eyes grew increasingly tired. "We should turn back," Jackson suggested after the second stop, concerned by Hope's labored breathing. "This is too much for her." But Reeves shook his head. "She's trying to tell us something. Look." Hope had struggled free of her handler's grasp and was limping determinedly toward a narrow ravine that veered away from the main trail to the lake. She stopped, looking back at the humans with unmistakable intent. "That's not the way to the lake," Sheriff Blackwood observed, consulting his GPS. "No," Reeves agreed, "but it's the direction Hope bolted during the original search. The area we could never fully explore because of the terrain." George Harrington was already following the dog, slipping and sliding in his inadequate footwear. If that's where she's leading us, that's where we go. The ravine proved impassable for the snowmobiles. They continued on foot, with Reeves now carrying Hope, who whined with increasing urgency. The narrow passage twisted between towering rock formations, the ground treacherously uneven beneath its blanket of snow. "There was a flash flood through here late summer," Sheriff Blackwood explained, breathing heavily with exertion. "Carved out new channels, moved boulders the size of cars." They had traveled perhaps half a mile when Hope began struggling violently in Reeves' arms. He set her down carefully, and she immediately began pawing at a snowdrift nestled against a rock face. "She's found something," Reeves said, dropping to his knees beside the dog. The men began digging through the compacted snow, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "There's something here," Sheriff Blackwood announced, his gloved hands encountering resistance beneath the snow. "Feels like fabric." George Harrington made a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. He pushed forward, digging frantically until his fingers closed around a small blue down jacket, the same jacket Timothy had been wearing when he disappeared. The discovery lent desperate energy to their efforts. Minutes later, they uncovered the small frozen form of Timothy Harrington, preserved by the cold, his body wedged into a narrow crevice that had protected him from scavengers. His face was peaceful, as though he were merely sleeping. Harrington fell to his knees beside his grandson's body, his shoulders shaking with silent grief. Hope limped forward and gently nuzzled the banker's hand, a gesture of such profound empathy that even Sheriff Blackwood had to look away, blinking rapidly. "Look," Reeves said softly, pointing to the scene before them. She made a nest. Around the boy's body were clear signs that Hope had remained with him: depressions in the ground, tufts of golden fur, and, most telling, the careful arrangement of leaves and soft debris that she had gathered around him in a futile attempt to keep him warm. "She stayed with him," Dr. Thompson whispered. "For how long?" "Days, maybe," Reeves replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Until the floodwaters rose and forced her out. That's why she was trying so desperately to get back. She didn't want to leave him alone." As if confirming this assessment, Hope lay down beside Timothy's body, her head resting gently on his chest. Her eyes found Ethan's, and something passed between them, something the adults could sense but not fully comprehend. "She kept her promise," Ethan said simply. The recovery operation took on a somber efficiency.
Sheriff Blackwood radioed for assistance, and soon park rangers arrived with proper equipment to transport Timothy's body. Throughout the process, George Harrington remained close to his grandson, occasionally reaching out to touch Hope with
a trembling hand. Dr. Thompson checked Hope's vital signs with growing concern. "Her pulse is weak and rapid," she reported. "We need to get her back immediately." But when they tried to move Hope, she resisted, pawing weakly at Timothy's jacket pocket. "She wants us to look for something," Reeves realized, gently turning back the frozen fabric. Inside the pocket they found it, the silver compass, its surface tarnished but intact. Harrington stared at the family heirloom in disbelief. "She tried to bring it back," Ethan said, "but it was too heavy for her mouth, and she wouldn't leave the boy." As Harrington clutched the compass, Hope seemed to relax, her mission finally complete. She allowed Reeves to lift her body a fraction of its healthy weight. But as they began the journey back to the vehicles, her breathing became increasingly labored. "She's crashing," Dr. Thompson warned, her voice sharp with professional concern. "Her body's giving out." They made a desperate dash for the snowmobiles, Hope cradled against Reeves's chest. The dog's eyes were fixed on Ethan, who rode ahead with his father, small face turned back toward her with unwavering focus. Halfway down the mountain, Hope's heart stopped. Pull over now," Dr. Thompson's voice crackled with urgency through the radio. Jackson immediately brought the snowmobile to a halt, snow spraying in an arc around them. Ethan twisted in his seat, his small face contorted with fear, as he watched the second snowmobile carrying Hope skid to a stop behind them. Dr. Thompson was off her vehicle before it fully stopped, medical bag already in hand as she rushed to where Reeves was carefully laying Hope's limp body on an emergency blanket spread hastily over the snow. "She's in cardiac arrest," the veterinarian announced, her professional demeanor barely masking her dismay. She began chest compressions immediately, her hands working with practiced precision on the dog's emaciated frame. "Marcus, my bag. I need the emergency kit." Ethan slipped from the snowmobile despite Jackson's attempt to hold him back. He trudged through the deep snow toward Hope, silent tears freezing on his cheeks. "Come on, girl," Dr. Thompson murmured as she worked. "Don't quit on us now. Your puppies need you." She administered an injection directly into Hope's heart, then resumed compressions with renewed determination. Sheriff Blackwood stood with one arm around a shell-shocked George Harrington, both men watching the desperate attempts to revive the dog who had remained faithful to a lost child long after others had given up. 1 minute passed, then 2. Hope remained unresponsive. "It's been too much for her system," Dr. Thompson said finally, her voice breaking. "The malnutrition, the pregnancy, the cold, and now this journey." She sat back on her heels, defeat written in every line of her face. "I'm so sorry. She's gone." A collective breath of grief escaped the assembled group. Reeves knelt beside his former partner, burying his face in her fur one last time. "Good girl," he whispered, voice cracking. "The best girl. But—" Ethan pushed forward, dropping to his knees in the snow. "No," he said with unusual force. "She promised she'd come back to the puppies." "Ethan," Jackson began gently, reaching for his son's shoulder. Ethan shrugged him off, placing his small hands on Hope's chest. "She says she's not done yet." He looked up at Dr. Thompson with fierce determination. "Try again." "She's still here. I can hear her." Something in the boy's certainty gave the veterinarian pause. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and resumed compressions. "Epinephrine," she said sharply to Reeves, who fumbled in her bag for another syringe. Time seemed suspended as they worked, the Montana wilderness silent around them, save for the sounds of their efforts and Ethan's soft, continuous whisper, "Come back, Hope. Your babies need you." Then, almost imperceptibly, Hope's chest rose on its own. A faint, thready pulse returned beneath Dr. Thompson's experienced fingers. "I've got a heartbeat," she announced, disbelief coloring her voice. "It's weak, but it's there." They worked with renewed urgency, wrapping Hope in thermal, blankets, administering fluids, and preparing her for immediate transport. "We need to get her to a proper veterinary hospital immediately," Dr. Thompson instructed, as they carefully loaded Hope onto a sled attached to Sheriff Blackwood's snowmobile. "I can stabilize her, but she needs blood transfusions, warming protocols, and intensive care." The journey down the mountain was a blur of tension and focus, every bump in the trail a potential threat to Hope's tenuous hold on life. At the ranger station, they transferred her to Dr. Thompson's truck, which had been hastily converted into a makeshift ambulance. "I'm coming." "With you?" Ethan insisted, his small face set with determination as they prepared to leave for the veterinary hospital in Missoula. Jackson hesitated, torn between his son's obvious need to stay with Hope and the practicalities of the situation. "Ethan, it's a long drive, and there might not be space." "The boy stays with the dog," George Harrington interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. He had been largely silent since the discovery of his grandson's body, but now he spoke with quiet authority. "I'll follow in my car with anything you need from your home, Wilson, but don't separate them. Not now." The drive to Missoula's emergency veterinary hospital was tense. Hope's condition deteriorated twice more during the journey, each time rallying just enough to continue. Dr. Thompson worked ceaselessly in the cramped back seat, while Ethan sat perfectly still, whispering words only Hope could hear. What followed was a night of painful uncertainty. Hope was immediately taken into intensive care upon arrival, leaving Ethan and Jackson in the sterile waiting room. Marcus Reeves paced restlessly, while Sheriff Blackwood handled the official reports about Timothy's recovery by phone. 2 of Hope's puppies died that night. Mrs. Jenkins, despite her experience with newborn animals, called in tears just after midnight. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed over the phone to Jackson. "The 2 smallest just couldn't make it without their mama. They were too weak to begin with. I've got the other 3 on warmers and feeding them every hour, but, Jackson, they need their mother." Jackson delivered this devastating news to Ethan, bracing himself for his son's reaction. But Ethan received the information with an eerie calm. "Hope already knows," he said simply. She felt them go. Around 3 a.m., the emergency veterinarian emerged, her scrubs splattered with blood and her face etched with fatigue. "She's alive," she announced to the waiting group. "Barely. We've transfused her, treated her for hypothermia, and started aggressive nutritional support. But I need to be honest with you, her condition is extremely critical. The next 24 hours will determine if she survives." "Can I see her?" Ethan asked, his voice small but steady. The veterinarian hesitated, then nodded briefly. "She's heavily sedated, but sometimes familiar presences can help." Hope lay in a tangle of tubes and wires, her once golden coat shaved in patches where catheters and monitoring devices had been placed. Her thin chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. She looked nothing like the proud service dog from the photographs Marcus had shared, and even less like the determined mother who had kept 5 puppies alive while trapped inside a wall. Ethan approached the bed quietly, placing his hand gently on Hope's paw. "Your other babies need you," he whispered. "Don't give up." By morning, word had spread throughout Pine Ridge and beyond. The story of a missing search dog found alive inside a wall after giving birth to puppies, then leading rescuers to a long-missing child before collapsing, captured public imagination. News crews gathered outside the veterinary hospital. Social media campaigns sprung up overnight. Hope the Miracle Dog began trending regionally. But inside the hospital, reality was far less triumphant. Hope's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the day. Her kidneys began failing from the prolonged dehydration and malnutrition. Infections set in from wounds she had sustained. In the wall, the trauma of the mountain journey had pushed her already compromised body beyond its limits. "We're losing her," the head veterinarian informed them gravely that evening. "Her organs are shutting down. I'm sorry, but I think it's time to consider ending her suffering." The suggestion hit like a physical blow. Marcus Reeves turned away, shoulders shaking. Jackson pulled Ethan close, feeling his son's small body go rigid with denial. George Harrington, who had remained at the hospital despite the ongoing arrangements for his grandson's funeral, spoke up unexpectedly. "Whatever it costs, whatever specialists need to be consulted, I'll cover it all. Please, try everything possible." The veterinarian shook her head sadly. "Mr. Harrington, this isn't about money. Hope's body has endured too much trauma. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let them go." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant beeping of machines. Then Ethan pulled, away from his father's embrace, his face set with the same determination Hope had shown on the mountain. "The puppies," he said suddenly. "Bring the puppies here." Jackson knelt to his son's level. "Ethan, I know you want to help, but the remaining puppies are very fragile. Moving them could be dangerous." "Hope needs them," Ethan insisted, his voice rising, "and they need her. Please, Dad, please." Something in his son's desperation reached Jackson. He exchanged glances with Dr. Thompson, who had remained at the hospital despite her exhaustion. "It's unorthodox," she said slowly, "but there are cases where the presence of offspring has stimulated maternal recovery responses." She sighed heavily. "At this point, it can't make things worse." 3 hours later, Mrs. Jenkins arrived with a special carrier containing the 3 surviving puppies, now nearly a week old. their eyes still closed but their tiny bodies squirming with life. The hospital staff, moved by the situation, made special arrangements for the reunion. Hope lay unresponsive as the puppies were carefully arranged against her side. For several minutes, nothing happened. The puppies nuzzled blindly against their mother's fur, seeking warmth and sustenance they couldn't find. Then, almost imperceptibly, Hope's ear twitched. Her nose moved slightly, sampling the scent of her offspring, and finally, with what seemed like monumental effort, she turned, her head just enough to touch the nearest puppy with her tongue. "That's it, girl," Marcus whispered, hope kindling in his voice for the first time in hours. "They need you just a little longer." But by midnight, despite the brief rally, Hope's readings were falling again. The puppies were returned to their incubator, and the team of caregivers prepared for the inevitable. Ethan, refusing to leave, had finally fallen asleep in a chair beside Hope's bed, his small hand still resting on her paw. Dawn was just breaking when the head veterinarian gathered them together, her face grave with the news they had been dreading. "I'm very sorry," she began. "Hope's latest readings indicate multiple organ failure. She won't survive the morning." The room fell silent, save for the steady beep of the monitors still tracking Hope's failing vital signs. Ethan, who had awakened at the veterinarian's words, stood perfectly still beside Hope's bed, his small face impassive in a way that broke Jackson's heart. Dr. Thompson placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, but he shrugged it off, retreating into the silence that had been his refuge since his mother's death. "We should say our goodbyes," Marcus Reeves said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "She deserves that much." One by one they approached the bed. Marcus went first, kneeling to whisper words too private for others to hear into Hope's ear. Sheriff Blackwood removed his hat, standing awkwardly but respectfully at the foot of the bed. Dr. Thompson checked Hope's IV lines one last time, a professional gesture that couldn't hide her personal grief. George Harrington surprised everyone by producing a small object from his pocket, Timothy's silver compass, polished now to a bright gleam. "I thought she might want to know," he said simply, placing the compass where Hope could see it, if she opened her eyes. "Timothy is going home today because of her." Jackson tried to coax Ethan forward, but his son remained rooted in the corner of the room, arms wrapped tightly around himself. Understanding his child's retreat into protective emotional shutdown, Jackson didn't push. The veterinary staff prepared the medications that would ease Hope's passing. The head veterinarian approached with gentle professionalism. "We can wait until you're ready," she assured them. "There's no rush for this final step." It was then that the hospital doors burst open and Deputy Tom Harris entered, breathless and disheveled. In his hands was a weathered backpack, crusted with mud and showing signs of long exposure to the elements. "Found this at first light," he announced without preamble. "Search team located it washed up against a beaver dam, about half a mile downstream from where the boy was found." George Harrington recognized it immediately. "That's Timothy's pack. We'd given up looking for it." The deputy nodded, his earlier skepticism replaced by an earnest intensity. "There's something inside you need to see, all of you." With careful hands, he unzipped the pack and removed a waterproof camera, the kind given to children for outdoor adventures. "Battery's dead, but the memory card was intact," he said, pulling out his phone, into which he had already inserted the card. "These were the last photos taken." The group gathered around as Deputy Harris scrolled through the images. The first few showed typical vacation snapshots: Timothy hiking with his parents, Timothy beside a campfire, Timothy proudly displaying a small fish he'd caught. Then came a series that made George Harrington audibly gasp. Timothy, having clearly wandered from the designated trails, photographing increasingly rugged terrain. Timothy beside a fast-moving stream, the water level noticeably higher than normal. Timothy looking concerned as he stood on a narrow ledge, the path behind him partially collapsed. And then Hope, the golden retriever, appeared in a series of photos, her search vest clearly visible, her expression alert and focused as she approached the stranded boy. The final images told a story more powerful than words. Hope leading Timothy carefully along a precarious route. Hope stopping the boy from drinking from a questionable water source. Hope curled around the child as night fell, keeping him warm in deteriorating weather conditions. The very last photo showed Timothy's hand resting on Hope's head, the boy's fingers tangled in her fur. He had taken it from above, his face not visible, but the gesture of trust and connection was unmistakable. "She found him," Marcus said in wonder. "She was with him the whole time." Deputy Harris nodded solemnly. "From the timestamps, she stayed with him for 2 days, trying to lead him back. The flash flood hit on the second night, must have separated them momentarily. By the time Hope found him again, he didn't need to finish. The evidence was clear. Hope had not only located Timothy but had remained with him, protecting him to the last, then tried desperately to bring help back to him, even after. It was too late." Tears streamed openly down George Harrington's face as he stared at the images. "All this time," he whispered. "All this time, I thought she'd failed. That the search team had failed. That I had failed by not being there. But she found him. He wasn't alone." The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the room. What had been a gathering for a sad farewell suddenly hummed with something more complex. Grief still, but mingled with awe and a profound sense of bearing witness to something extraordinary. Ethan, who had been watching silently from his corner, suddenly moved forward with the directness that was uniquely his. He reached for Deputy Harris's phone and brought it to Hope's bedside. He placed it near her nose, the screen still displaying the final image of Timothy's hand in her fur. "See," he said, his voice clear in the hushed room. "You did it. You kept your promise." Hope's eyelids fluttered. A soft whine escaped her throat, the first voluntary sound she had made since collapsing on the mountain. The head veterinarian stepped forward, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Her heart rate is stabilizing," she reported, professional caution tempering her evident shock. Dr. Thompson moved quickly to Hope's side, conducting her own examination. "Respiratory rate improving as well," she confirmed. "This is unexpected." "It's the memory," Ethan said with the simple certainty that often accompanied his most startling insights. "She needed to know she didn't fail." The medical team exchanged glances, science and rationality battling with the undeniable evidence before them. The euthanasia drugs were quietly returned to their cabinet. New medications were ordered, this time to support recovery rather than ease passing. As morning stretched into afternoon, Hope's vital signs continued their improbable improvement. The puppies were brought in again, and this time Hope responded, more strongly, weakly licking each one as they were placed against her side. "I can't explain it medically," the head veterinarian admitted to Jackson as they watched from the doorway. "By all measures, her organs were shutting down. The trajectory was clear and irreversible. Some things can't be measured by machines," Jackson replied, watching as Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor beside Hope's bed, talking softly to her as he supervised the puppies' reunion with their mother. Word of the miraculous turnaround spread quickly, amplified by the dramatic revelation of Timothy's photographs. The media gathering outside the veterinary hospital doubled, then tripled. Social media exploded with the story, now enhanced by the release of several of Timothy's photos showing Hope's heroic efforts to save the boy. Late that afternoon, George Harrington requested a private moment with Jackson. The two men stood in the hospital's small courtyard, their breath visible in the cold Montana air. "Wilson," the banker began awkwardly, "about your home." Jackson raised a hand to stop him. "I don't want charity, George. What happened with Hope and Timothy is separate from my financial situation." "It's not charity," Harrington replied with unusual humility. "It's atonement. When Timothy disappeared, I became obsessed with finding someone to blame. The search team, the park rangers, myself, and yes, that dog. I convinced myself they'd failed my grandson. He paused, struggling visibly with his emotions. I took that anger out on others, including you and your mortgage situation. You were grieving, Jackson said, uncomfortable with the confession but recognizing its significance. Grief doesn't excuse cruelty, Harrington said firmly. The truth is, your loan modification application should have been approved months ago. I blocked it personally. He met Jackson's surprised gaze directly. That ends today. The modification will be processed immediately, with terms that reflect current market rates. Jackson absorbed this information silently, torn between relief and lingering resentment. Why tell me this now? Because I need you to understand it's not a reward or a thank you. It's simply right. Harrington hesitated, then added more softly. And because I think our families are going to be connected from now on. Inside, Hope had begun to take small amounts of water on her own. The veterinary staff moved with an air of cautious optimism, updating treatment plans that had only hours before been focused on palliation rather than recovery. Late that evening, when the visitors had been reduced to only Jackson, Ethan, and Marcus Reeves, who refused to leave, the USB drive found in Hope's collar was finally examined. Sheriff Blackwood arrived with a laptop, his expression somber, as he inserted the small device. Figured we should know what's on here, he explained, given everything else that's happened. The drive contained only a single video file, dated from the day of Hope's disappearance. When opened, it showed Timothy Harrington's face, unnervingly close to the camera in the way children often film themselves. If anyone finds this, the boy's voice was clear despite the poor recording quality. My name is Timothy Harrington. I got lost, but Hope found me. The camera panned shakily to show the retriever standing vigilant beside him. It's getting dark, and it's starting to rain really hard. Hope keeps trying to make me go a certain way, but I can't climb that hill. The video continued, documenting Timothy's increasing concern as night fell and the weather worsened. Hope's protective behavior was evident, bringing the boy under a rocky overhang, pressing against him for warmth, alerting to sounds in the darkness. The final segment was filmed in near total darkness, illuminated only by the camera's small light. Timothy's voice was drowsy, his words slightly slurred. I'm really cold now. Hope is keeping me warm, but I'm so tired. If something happens to me, please tell my grandpa it wasn't Hope's fault. She's the best dog ever. She didn't give up. The video ended abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Marcus Reeves wiped tears from his cheeks without shame. Sheriff Blackwood stared at the frozen final frame, his usual stoicism cracked by emotion. We need to show this to George, the sheriff said finally. It's what the boy wanted. But it was Ethan who articulated what they all felt. In his characteristically direct way, now everyone will know the truth. Hope didn't fail. She was a hero all along. Spring came late to Pine Ridge that year. April brought the first tentative shoots of green through melting snow, as if the land itself had been holding its breath through the long Montana winter. The Wilson house stood transformed, not just by the new coat of blue paint or the repaired porch steps, but by the sense of life and purpose that now emanated from within. The foreclosure sign had long since been removed, replaced by a simple wooden plaque beside the front door, Hope's Haven. Inside, Jackson Wilson sat at the kitchen table, reviewing paperwork for the new service dog training center he and Marcus Reeves had established on the property. What had begun as a small idea, using Hope's story to promote search and rescue training, had blossomed into something far more significant. With funding from the Harrington Foundation and land donated by several local ranchers, Hope's Haven was now training specialized service dogs for children with autism and other sensory processing disorders. Dad, Ethan's voice clear and excited carried from the backyard. Hope's showing Miracle how to find the scent markers. Jackson moved to the window, watching as his son guided the now healthy golden retriever and her nearly grown pup through a training exercise. Hope moved with the deliberate precision of an experienced working dog, occasionally nudging her offspring back on track with gentle corrections. The physical scars of her ordeal remained. A slight limp in her gait, patches of fur that had grown back a different shade, but her eyes were bright and alert, her tail held high with purpose. Miracle, the only female of Hope's surviving puppies, had proven to be exceptionally attuned to Ethan. The bond between boy and dog had developed naturally and powerfully, surprising even Dr. Thompson with its depth. Where Ethan had once been, nearly nonverbal with strangers, he now spoke with confidence when Miracle was at his side. The doorbell rang, drawing Jackson from his reverie. He opened it to find George Harrington on the porch, looking more relaxed than Jackson had ever seen him. The banker had retired shortly after Timothy's funeral, dedicating himself instead to the foundation established in his grandson's name. "Right on time," Jackson greeted him. "Ethan's been waiting all morning." "Can't keep my best volunteer waiting, can I?" George replied with a smile that had once been rare, but now came easily. He held up a bag from the local bakery. Brought donuts for the team. The two men had forged an unlikely friendship in the months following Hope's recovery. United initially by circumstance, they had discovered common ground in their shared experiences of loss and redemption. George had lost a grandson but found purpose. Jackson had nearly lost his home but found a community. Outside, Mrs. Jenkins sat in a lawn chair, overseeing a group of children who had gathered for the Saturday training program. Each child had been carefully matched with a service dog in training, the pairs working together under the watchful eyes of Marcus Reeves and several volunteer handlers. What had begun as therapy for Ethan had expanded to serve children from 3 surrounding counties. "There you are," Dr. Thompson called, approaching from the barn that had been converted into a veterinary station. "George, I was hoping you'd bring those adoption papers for the new litter." Hope's story had not ended with her recovery against all medical predictions. She had not only survived, but thrived, eventually becoming healthy enough to be cleared for a carefully monitored final pregnancy. The resulting litter of 7 puppies, all showing the intelligence and temperament that made their mother extraordinary, had become the cornerstone of Hope's Haven's breeding program. "Got them right here?" George patted his briefcase. "All approved and ready for the matching ceremony next weekend." The matching ceremony had become something of a local tradition, a joyful gathering where children with special needs met the puppies that would become their service animals and lifelong companions. The community turned out in force for these events, celebrating each new beginning with the same spirit that had once united them in search and rescue. Sheriff Blackwood's cruiser pulled up the driveway, followed by Deputy Harris's truck. The two men had become regular visitors, with the deputy volunteering his surprising talent for carpentry to help with the ongoing renovations to the property. "Brought the new training equipment," the sheriff announced, lowering the tailgate to reveal several well-crafted obstacle course elements. "Tom here stayed up half the night finishing them." The deputy, who had once been Hope's most vocal skeptic, now blushed slightly at the acknowledgement. "Just trying to do my part," he mumbled, though his pride was evident. The yard gradually filled with volunteers and participants, the spring day taking on the festive atmosphere that had become characteristic of weekends at Hope's Haven. Jackson watched it all with quiet amazement, still sometimes unable to believe how dramatically their lives had changed in just a few months. Not all the changes had been easy. Timothy's funeral had been attended by the entire town, a somber reminder that Hope's miracle had come too late for the boy she had tried so desperately to protect. George had struggled through periods of profound grief, questioning whether knowing the truth was better than the uncertainty that had preceded it. And Hope herself had faced a long, difficult recovery. There had been setbacks, infections, weakness, days when the trauma seemed to resurface in nightmares that left her whimpering and alert. But through it all, she had shown the same determination that had kept her alive inside the Wilson wall. With each small victory, The first time she managed to climb the stairs unassisted, the day she brought a toy to Ethan unprompted. Her triumphant return to limited search and rescue training. Hope reminded them all of the resilience that had first captured their hearts. Ethan now approached the gathering adults, Miracle trotting faithfully at his heel and Hope following, at a more sedate pace. "We're ready for the demonstration," he announced, with the confidence that still sometimes startled Jackson. This was not the same boy who had whispered fearfully about sounds in his wall less than a year ago. The demonstration had become a highlight of the training days, a carefully orchestrated search and rescue scenario where Hope and Miracle showed the newer dogs what was expected of them. Today, Ethan himself would be hidden, allowing the trained dogs to locate him by scent. As the gathered crowd moved toward the training field, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. Jackson recognized it immediately, the producer from the documentary team that had been chronicling Hope's story for the past 3 months. What had begun as a small local interest piece had evolved into a feature-length film slated for national distribution. "Sorry I'm late," the producer called, hurrying to join them with camera in hand. "Didn't want to miss the demonstration." The community had initially been wary of the media attention, protective of both Hope and Ethan, but the documentary team had proven respectful and genuine, capturing not just the dramatic elements of the rescue, but the quieter moments of healing and connection that followed. "Let them tell her whole story," Ethan had insisted when Jackson hesitated over the filming permission forms. "So other kids will know that sometimes being different means you hear things nobody else can hear." As the group gathered at the edge of the training field, Jackson felt a swell of gratitude for his son's wisdom. Hope's story deserved to be told, not just the dramatic rescue, but the patient rebuilding that followed. The cold nights when she had whimpered in her sleep, remembering the mountain and the child she couldn't save. The mornings when her strength failed, but her spirit didn't. The moment she had first recognized Ethan as not just her rescuer, but her partner. The demonstration began with Marcus giving Hope her search command. Despite her age and injuries, she moved with purpose across the field, nose working the air currents methodically. Miracle followed, learning through observation as she had since birth. When they located Ethan, hidden beneath a camouflaged tarp in a distant copse of trees, Hope gave her alert bark, still strong and clear despite everything she had endured. The gathered crowd applauded as Ethan emerged, his face flushed with pride as he rewarded both dogs with enthusiastic praise and treats. Hope accepted her reward with dignity, while Miracle danced excitedly at the boy's feet. That evening, as twilight settled over Pine Ridge, the Wilson house grew quiet again. The visitors departed, the training equipment was stowed away, and Jackson found himself on the porch swing, watching the last colors fade from the sky. Hope lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, eyes half closed in contentment. Ethan emerged from the house with a book and settled beside his father on the swing. Miracle immediately claimed the space at his feet, positioning herself protectively beside her mother. "Dad," Ethan said after a comfortable silence, "do you think Hope remembers everything from the wall and the mountain?" Jackson considered the question carefully. "I think she remembers the important parts," he answered finally. "Not the pain or the fear, but the purpose, the promises she kept." Ethan nodded, satisfied with this answer. He opened his book, a new one about training service dogs that Marcus had given him, and began to read quietly as darkness fell completely. Jackson gazed out at the property that had so nearly slipped from his grasp. The house that had once felt empty and haunted by grief now pulsed with purpose and possibility. The walls that had hidden Hope's desperate struggle now sheltered her triumphant recovery. The community that had once viewed Ethan's differences with uncertainty now celebrated his unique gifts. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that was immediately answered by another of its kind. Hope's ears twitched at the sound, but she didn't rise, content in the knowledge that her own pack was safe beside her. Some walls, Jackson reflected, were meant to be broken, not just the physical ones that had imprisoned hope, but the invisible. Barriers between people, between understanding and ignorance, between loss and redemption. In the quiet of that spring evening, with his son reading peacefully beside him and two remarkable dogs at their feet, Jackson Wilson knew with certainty that healing was not just possible, but inevitable, when you found the courage to listen for the sounds no one else could hear. Sometimes, the most profound connections in life come when we least expect them. Hope's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we can still find purpose through unexpected bonds. Like many who've weathered life's storms, losing loved ones, facing challenges, or feeling increasingly invisible in a rapidly changing world, Hope refused to surrender to circumstances that would have broken a lesser spirit. She persevered, not for herself, but for those who needed her. Ethan's ability to hear what others dismissed mirrors the wisdom many carry, insights often overlooked by those moving too quickly through life. The community that ultimately rallied around this unlikely pair reflects the neighborhoods we remember, where people showed up for one another without hesitation. As we face our own struggles, Hope's story teaches us that our greatest contributions might still lie ahead. Our experiences, our patience, our hard-won wisdom, these aren't burdens, but gifts waiting to be shared. Like Hope, emerging from darkness to heal a fractured community, your presence continues to illuminate the paths of those around you. Your story isn't finished. Your purpose endures. Your voice still deserves to be heard.